Pre-season testing, we come to the race one of the 2019 Formula One World Championship at Albert Park in Melbourne, Australia. This will be the first chance we've had to see the cars in their true guise. The teams are no longer to have the secrecy that they had in testing, where they can cover the cars in the garages and when in the pit lane. So we can actually see the cars bared for the first time. We're also going to see the parts that the teams may have been hiding away through testing to keep some of those secrets tucked away. And certainly looking up and down the field, there are bits and pieces on nearly every car. But for this week, what we're going to do is focus very much on the big and the important changes up and down the grid. And of all of these, probably no more important for one particular team than it was for the update that's been on the Racing Point car. Now, we've spoken about the Racing Point car quite at length on Motorsport.tech already. And this is very much an evolution car. It uses aspects of the 2018 car that have been modified with some big updates with the suspension and the side pods. But it's only at Melbourne now that we actually see the big aero package that the team had envisaged for this car from the very beginning. Through testing, they were running an interim aero package, so we haven't really looked very closely at that. First of all, the big changes around the barge board area. Lots of changes here. Overall similar in concept, we have to say, to the testing setup, but what they've done is they've made these barge boards even more complicated. So first of all, you look at the foot plate, there's more serrations and spikes sticking out, the same on the top edge of the barge board, more serrations, more edges, creating more tweaks to the airflow to create this outwash that's really so important this year now that the front wings have been simplified. Furthermore, they've added what we call a boomerang, which is this wing that slopes over the top of the barge boards. Now, in 2018, teams had these and they were allowed to be much higher. Regulation changes for 2019 means that you have to be a lot lower, but still they're very effective at turning airflow down, so the upwash coming from the front wing through the front suspension is turned downwards, pushed low around the side pods to get most downforce possible at the back of the car. Equally, the vanes, what I call X vanes at the side of the side pods, these have changed. Initially a fairly straightforward setup, now much more complicated, and you can see how these three separate panels are all working together to push the airflow out around the car to separate the nice clean flow that goes along the inside of the car to that which is being pushed away, which is the dirty wake from the front tyres. So lots of changes there on the Racing Point. This year, lots of talk about mirrors. Not perhaps the most important things aerodynamically in terms of performance, but still it's an area teams have been allowed to play with. The mirrors have been moved outboard slightly this year, which means the teams are playing with the two mountings that they're allowed. And you have to say Racing Point are one of the teams that have really gone the furthest with this. So the mirror pod, which actually looks slightly larger than it would normally, is supported almost completely wrapped around by vanes, one going inboard to the monocoque, which is a part of the rules, and then one which goes straight back to the side pods. Again, that's the two mountings that you're allowed to have within the regulations. But very much oversized, clearly for aerodynamic benefit to shape the airflow down over the side pods and around the side pods with that lower mount. Quite interesting, and probably pushing the regulations as far as I think the FAA will want to go, but showing that there is some real aggressive design in this car. Next we come to Williams, very much a team that is suffering lots of challenges at the moment with the team and with the performance of its car, but changes nonetheless to the FW42 here in Melbourne. First key change was the mirrors, so the mirror pod, which was originally vane shaped on the Williams, that's been changed for a much more conventional setup, which is a ducted mirror pod, very similar to what Ferrari used last year. Lots of other teams have gone this direction, and some fairly straightforward mountings, one vertical one and one off down to the cockpit, exactly as the regulations demand. So Williams really going much more conventional in this area than pushing their luck with the interpretations of what was on there initially. Likewise with the front suspension, Williams had this separate leg on the front lower wishbone, and this was carrying perhaps brake pipes or cabling or tethers, something like this, which was again another stretch of the regulations. Williams have now packaged whatever was in this separate member inside the main wishbone, and that aerodynamic benefit which they could have gained from the positioning of this extra member in the suspension has been lost, but I don't think that is a primary performance change for the team. It's just one of those little tweaks that they like to have, but for legality purposes, they've just changed it for something much safer for the first race of the year. Looking back along the car, performance has been increased, particularly around the street circuit type circuit, which is Albert Park here in Melbourne. And what they've done is added a T-wing at the rear of the engine cover, very similar to what they've run in previous years. The outboard sections are ramped up, so they will actually create downforce. So the middle section is ramped down, which does seem a little bit unusual, but this is creating a downwash ahead of the rear wing, which actually allows the rear wing to work a little bit better. So overall, this T-wing adding immensely to rear downforce, absolutely critical on a circuit such as Albert. Mercedes, the leading team. Through testing, lots of people were questioning whether the regulations had tripped the team up, whether it worked against their aerodynamic philosophy, whether they'd actually got all of that wrong through 2 aero updates they had through testing. But of course, we know a team like Mercedes, the strength and depth they have in their engineering department means that they were unlikely to be struggling for very long. And we can see already from Melbourne that absolutely, they're setting the pace this year, and it's going to be a very tight championship. In terms of what's changed on the Mercedes W10 at Melbourne, not too much. A couple of little interesting details. These aren't enough to explain the big step that we had between the troubled handling they had through testing to the pole-winning performance that they've had in Melbourne. First of all was the front wing, and the front wing flap, the rearmost front wing flap, has been changed very slightly. The chord, the length of the wing has been shallowed ever so much, a bit less angle of attack. And then where the wing splits for the adjustable section and then the section which mounts directly to the end plate, that again has been just flattened off a little bit. And some people are calling this a new wing. I wouldn't describe this as a new wing. This is just the point upgrade that you get throughout every race, where they just change something ever so slightly. So these are new parts, but they aren't a big concept change. So we aren't seeing Mercedes moving towards the tapered Ferrari or Alfa Romeo designed front wing. This is far from what's going on. But still, this little intersection with the wing itself and the end plate around by the front tyre is critical in how they manage the outwash and the airflow in this area. So this is a small tweak for Mercedes rather than something that's a big gain. The other end of the car, the rear wing, also gets some updates, which is something that we've not seen before. So what we call the DRS pod, which is the carbon fibre housing that holds the hydraulic systems which open and close the rear wing as DRS is activated. The shape of this pod has changed, and the trailing edge of this pod, rather than just being a flush cut where the airflow just suddenly reaches the end of the bodywork and then just breaks up ahead of the rear wing, which is what teams don't want. What Mercedes have done is actually made the serrated edge to the rear facing part of the DRS pod, and what this does, it just breaks the airflow up a lot more gently, which will reduce drag a little bit. It will introduce the airflow turbulence that this creates, and this should then mean that when the rear wing is closed, that the rear wing is working slightly better, and when DRS closes the rear wing, the slightly tidier airflow should allow the airflow to attach much better to the rear wing as it then starts to create downforce again. Again, not a big change, just one of those little clever things that we often see on teams that are on top of their game. Teams like Ferrari, Red Bull and Mercedes always introducing little interesting touches like this. Ahead of the first Grand Prix, there was talk that Red Bull were going to introduce big aero updates, which were planned for much later in the season, potentially from China, be brought forwards. We're a little bit disappointed in some respects that we've only seen one small detail change on the front wing end plate, but that doesn't mean other things haven't changed, because often changes in Formula One are so small that you would have to literally have the CAD or the individual parts next to each other to see the subtle changes. But the key change that we can see, which as I say is probably allied to lots of other less visible changes, is in the front wing end plate, and they followed which most of the teams that have run the full width wings, the version 1 wings as I've been calling them pre-season, is just put a little notch in the trailing edge of the end plate. This is again something that the team were probably planning long in advance. It's not a response to what other teams are doing. This is fairly standard fare for what teams do with end plates around the front wing and the rear wing to an extent as well. So by opening up the trailing edge of the end plate here, what they're doing is trying to reduce the vortex that rolls along the top of the end plate, interfering with the vortex which is created at the wingtip. And you can actually see now that the wingtip is fully exposed in this notch, which means the airflow spilling off from this wing can actually work around the front tyre to offset the turbulence that the front tyre is creating, the vortices coming off of the outside tread into around the sidewall of the front tyre, which just again stops that turbulence going back, hitting the rear of the car. So small change. Further back down the grid, Renault have introduced some new parts, again very typical of what we tend to see at some of these early races where teams are still bringing small updates and revisions to their initial testing and first race package. So what we see on the Renault is just a small change to the front wing. So the front wing flap has been changed ever so slightly, and it's this rearmost flap again, the most influential one in changing how much downforce the wing creates and where the airflow off of that goes around the front wheel into the brake ducts and in the Y250 area, how that then goes back towards the barge boards. But for Renault, it looks like they're looking at this outboard section again, and they've just created a little curve to this outboard element of flap, put a gurney flap on that. And what this means is this little rearmost section of wing out by the end plate's working just that little bit harder, and again that means that it'll create a little bit more outwash, just pushing the airflow out around the outside of the tyre. And then lastly we go to Toro Rosso, and a car with lots of updates, but one that's been missed by much of the paddock, and still a team that turned in good performance in Australia. First of all, they've made a change to the front wing, which of course is the most important part of the car at the moment. It's the part that's going to see the most changes early through the season as teams learn these new regulations. And what Toro Rosso have done are focused on the inner tips of the front wing. So what you have is the neutral centre section of wing, 25 centimetres from the centre of the car outwards. And this is defined by the FIA, the teams can't play with it. But when it then changes to the arch section of wing, this is under the team's design. And this is where we create the Y250 vortex. Why? It's called Y250. First of all, the Y means it's measured sideways, which is a CAD terminology in terms of the orientation of the measurement. 250 because it's 250 millimetres. And the team's now creating airflow in this area, which goes inside the front wheel, turns out around the barge boards and pushes the front tyre weight away from the car. So as much as the FIA have tried to stop outwash this year, this outwash created from the Y250 remains almost unchanged. So it's a very powerful airflow. Teams have been using this since 2009. What Toro Rosso have done is, rather than having fingertip inner tips to the front wing, they've actually just folded these all down inboard, pointing downwards. It just creates a slightly stronger Y250 vortex. Small change, but it's probably quite important in the general airflow over the front of the car. Big change there for Toro Rosso. We have also seen the shoulder fin that we saw in prototype form in testing now be fitted to the outboard section, the shoulders of these side pods, all painted up. Now you would never believe that it was never there before. Small aero change, but just shows how teams go from prototype parts in testing to fully finished, fully painted, fully validated aero parts on the race car. Very important again for Toro Rosso to get these parts onto the car really quickly to keep their development moving. Then lastly we'll look at the rear wing, and a couple of little details that we can see of the rear wing. Now these aren't actually new, but I'll pick them up because there's a couple of corrections I need to make here. First of all, if we look at the DRS pod, it actually extends with a swan neck to be another pivot for the rear wing flap, so the actual rear wing pivots up when DRS is activated by the rearmost part of this DRS pod. Now I've noticed this on the Ferrari this season and I've been calling it a Ferrari style pod, but to be completely fair to Toro Rosso, what it actually was introduced last season by Toro Rosso, we should really be calling this a Toro Rosso design initially anyway. So again, new innovations from Toro Rosso being copied by other teams, nothing new. And the other thing on the rear wing that I want to talk about is just this front top corner of the end plate. Now this is an area where in previous years Toro Rosso were quite innovative and had these openings, these louvers going all the way to the front of the end plate, which helps reduce the drag of the rear wing by trying to reduce the tip vortices, which we see as vapour trails. Now the FIA have banned them this year, not because of their drag reducing performance, not because that they're a very clever idea, but because they wanted the side of the wing to be flat, which is better for sponsor logos. So a marketing led decision rather than a performance one. But the teams have obviously lost some performance because the drag of the end plate now is much greater because of the tip vortices is much less managed. What Toro Rosso have done is actually just creased the end plate in slightly, and what this just does is just create a little bit of high pressure on the outside of the end plate just before the wing tip, which just balances the airflow and the pressure that you have in this region, which produces a slightly smaller tip vortex. Again, those things that we see as vapour trails, particularly evident this weekend around Melbourne. And by doing that, you're reducing drag, which means the performance of your engine can be given over to either a higher top speed or you can run more downforce. So it's the efficiency of the car that has been improved.